sounded
Yo.
fun, even though you did. It's kind of a
Sup?
entry, but you know what? I thought I'd add it in. Like, usually what would happen is one person would say a meme is corny, and people would switch up. That's it. They see someone else is finding something they like corny, and now they don't look corny. They switch up. So if I were to say, I don't know, the Jet 2 holiday audio is corny, and I drop a video about it, it goes insanely viral. People might switch up on it. I don't know. Next to me is Sigma Man. Okay, low key, this is a good thing that I think the world needs to realize how corny this shit was. A lot of them idolize anti-fake Patrick Bacon, the Joker, the glaze for them was nuts. Like, during this era, all you would see were just edits. And anything they said that the Sigma male resonated with heavy. It could have been the smallest shit ever, still would make an edit about it. They would actually do it. Sigma males really thought they were mysterious just because they followed Patrick Bateman's morning routine. And because someone had goals, dreams, and aspirations, they really think they're different. They're not like those other sheep out there in the world. They're different. But yeah, this switch up wasn't really that sudden, but a lot of people, I guess, just grew up or either realized that it was garbage. Next, we have Pat God. Now, I watched Pat God for a bit in 2022, and I would see his calls packing streamers and well, yeah, he just became a meme, and then people just slowly started switching up on it. Because people would dead-ass blaze this dude for no reason. Like, they think he's, like, the destroyer of all competition, and he's gonna roast you to the grave. When in reality, it's just him saying a bunch of bullshit for entertainment. Now, I would just watch Pat God whenever he would show up in my feed in 2022, but that's really about it, to be honest. And I don't really hate him now, I just think the meme is funny. Where people would pretend like the earth is shattering once their friend gets Pat God on the line. But yeah, I thought that meme was funny, and yeah, a lot of people switched up on it. Whether because his content got old, or there were clips of him calling him a cornball, and doing like those Opera GX raps. And there were a lot of clips of people ironically fearing him going around. But yeah, it was a meme a couple months ago to clown Pat God and fear him ironically. But I don't know if people do it anymore. Whole lot of red. On December 5th, 2020, a whole lot of trash was trending on Twitter, and everyone hated this album. But people who were already introduced to the Rage style, they really messed with the album. But in 2021 and 2022, people switched up on
Copper?
Okay, I don't know why
What?
I'm including
Copper X?
Thank God the Cardi is a crazy transition. But yeah, whole lot of red, a lot of people hated it at first. And I was a lot of people. I hated it at first. I had rap caviar ears, bro. My ears didn't get the meal. I'm sorry, bro. I switched up on it. I came around in 2021 and like, oh, well, that's pretty good. Yeah, because you just fucking listen to it, dumb. But I didn't just give that shit a chance. I mean, I just didn't say, over and over again. I'm like, God, fuck this shit. Like, I would have actually liked Die in Place at the time because they were more still songs. But yeah, Whole Lot of Red in 2021 and 2022 had a lot of TikTok sounds. Majority of the songs at that point. And then 2021 and 2022 by blue balling his audience. And in 2020, I wanted more of a dialect sound. But I heard the audios going around on TikTok. I'm like, oh, this is a bit stuffy right there. I was dead ass annoyed, bro. I know this shit. Like, my playlist dead ass is wrapped out. The Fortnite 2020. Now, in 2018, Fortnite was at its peak. That shit was in its prime. 2019 was a bit of a quality, especially on the net. But you had all these celebrities playing Fortnite. Like, there was a whole squad one, like Ray Travis, Ninja, and Juju Smith. Yeah, that's how close this game is. But once these people started pushing these movies, really trying to glaze Minecraft, what these movies actually were Fortnite bad and Minecraft good. So yeah, let's look at this ancient topic. Alright, let's see. So we got the Fortnite and Avengers collab. And then we got on the bottom. Oh my god, I always want to read this out. Fortnite early prepared. Okay, now I don't know if these records Fortnite is they always say Fortnite. But because some people didn't want to lose their precious Reddit karma, they would switch up and say they never liked Fortnite. Act like they never liked it. And said, yeah, Minecraft's good, boy, because PewDiePie played it. But yeah, the original photo, we got the Reddit logo, thumbs up. The Reddit logo. Pissed off because of Fortnite. Okay, I don't know what Reddit humor was before, but yeah, this whole movement. Now, I remember everyone picked up Minecraft again in 2019. Like, that doesn't mean the other games moving to Minecraft. Like, some people who really switched up on Fortnite were playing that shit in 2018. There's no way. And they enjoyed every second of it. Next, we have videos with low res. People will switch up if the video has no likes, which is a very low amount. Okay, I know this one doesn't really make sense, but I guess people just want videos with high like counts and they're recently liked. Okay, I don't know. This one makes no sense. But I guess if they actually do like a video with a low amount of likes,
Yeah,
they
no
hit that
such
one
thing.
button, and then they see it as low likes or like that. So yeah, less indeed. But yeah, before I embarrass myself any further with that shit even entry, next we have Kai Cenat. Now, I felt like this dude was literally nobody could touch this guy. No one. If you came on Kai Cenat, you'd be given the death penalty. Okay, I haven't really seen that much Kai Cenat recently. I don't know what school this one was made recently. All I know is 3 months ago, people were saying he'd have music style. Like, he would find super niche artists and then, like, show it off, I guess. He tapped in with that. Like, I don't know if you want a cookie, bro, you're niche, alright? We get it, bro. And he would also make fun of how his cat would just stand up and he would be unemployed all day. Because how is this cat moving during the day when it's not free? People are really sitting in there all day waiting. That's crazy. And people would get
I know it.
standing off their bounds
It is a copper
for Kai Cenat
thingy.
to utter their name. But yeah, that happens to like every popular streamer at this point. But I don't know. I just thought I'd mention it. And a lot of people been switching up on Kai also due to him just being fake on stream as well. But yeah, I haven't looked into it, but apparently Eric isn't off on stream or something. I think I'm just staying for it. But yeah, that's gonna do it for the video. Watch this video right here. It's all about
This is so cool.
Go watch it. Go watch it now.
No way.
Prison escape of the Alcatraz. Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary, better known as Alcatraz, is inter-
Bro.
the craziest prison escapes of all time. Doors and successfully escaped the prison and achieved freedom once again. But this was only his first escape attempt, as 3 days after his initial escape, he was already back into his custody because he was found stealing supplies from a local hospital. Because of this escape and attempted theft, he was given another life sentence and transferred to a different prison. Originally, Yoshi was actually placed back in the original prison he escaped from, but during World War II in 1942, Yoshi was actually transferred to another prison, known as Akita Prison, where he found himself in harsher conditions. And the guards at the prison were very privy to his escape attempt, and they wanted to make sure that they made an example of Yoshi. One of the additional punishments that Yoshi received at this new prison was extended solitary confinement. And these solitary confinement rooms were literally designed for escape artists. They had smooth copper walls, the ceiling was extremely high, and the only way in and out was the front door, besides a skylight that was at the very top of the very high ceiling, which obviously nobody could reach. Right? Well, almost anybody could reach. Because on June 15th, in solitary confinement, Yoshi decided to escape once again. When I say Yoshi was a master escape artist, I mean it. And he was able to escape this unescapable room. And how he did it was he first got out of his handcuffs. Oh yeah, he was literally kept in handcuffs 24/7 in this new prison just because they wanted to make extra sure he would not escape. But obviously that didn't stop him. He escaped in his handcuffs by finding a piece of wire once again in his solitary confinement. Where it came from, we don't know. But regardless, he used it to unpick his handcuffs. At this point, his hands were free, and he began to use his bare palms and feet to scale the sides of this extremely tall prison cell. Not only was Yoshi a master lockpicker, he was also a very talented climber, and this came in handy here. And after a few attempts, he was able to make it to this skylight, which was sealed by metal bars and impossible to escape through, besides the fact that it had a wooden frame securing those metal bars. And that wooden frame was rotting due to its exposure to the elements. Now, Yoshi wasn't able to just break this wood frame in one go. But similar to the first story where the man broke through the concrete over time, Yoshi over time was able to chip away at the wooden window frame until he was able to escape through the roof of this unescapable room. Once Yoshi was certain that the wooden frame was brittle enough, he waited until a particularly stormy night to bust through the roof, as he assumed on a stormy night the guards would be less likely to suspect tapping on the ceiling through footsteps and more likely to simply write them off as rain, which is exactly what he did, and it worked flawlessly. And once again, Yoshi was a free man. Now this time you must be asking yourself, okay, obviously he didn't steal again, right? He escaped prison twice, almost an impossible impossible feat. There's no way he was going to steal again to go back to prison, right? And you're technically right, but obviously he did go back to jail because we still have 2 more escapes to talk about. And the reason he was sent back to prison is rather unique. After his 3 months of essentially homeless freedom, he decided to pay one of the head guards from Akita prison a visit, because this head guard was one of the only ones who never beat and abused him. The guard recognized Yoshi at his door and let him in and fed Yoshi and allowed him to tell his story. And Yoshi explained to the head guard that he was here simply to tell him his plan because he deserved to know, because he was the only one who treated Yoshi well. Yoshi explained how he wanted to go to America to raise awareness about the human rights violations that were taking place in Japanese prison, and hopefully through this awareness and a civil lawsuit be able to gain his freedom once again. And while this head guard seems to be respectful and listening, when Yoshi went to use the washroom, this head guard unsurprisingly called the police, and Yoshi was sent back to prison once again. Now this time, Yoshi requested that he at least go to a Tokyo prison, where it's a bit warmer, because the first 2 prisons he had spent time in were in the northern part of Japan, where it was relatively cold, which only added to the distress that he experienced within prison. However, this 3rd prison he was sent to was not in Tokyo, and not in a warm climate at all. It was actually the northernmost prison in all of Japan, known as Abashiri Prison. And the guards at this prison were not messing around. At this point, they knew this man was extremely clever, and not only escaped from 1 prison, but from 2, using different methods. And when they booked him into this 3rd prison, they made sure that he would never escape again. He was in a cell that only had openings that were smaller than the human body, which could not possibly escape. He was given custom-fit ankle cuffs and arm cuffs that were behind his back without keyholes, so they could not possibly be picked. And he was almost always by himself in freezing cold conditions. And on top of this, his life sentence was only extended due to his additional escape. So realistically, at this point, Yoshi had nothing to live for. His arms and legs were bound. There was absolutely no opportunity for escape, and he was alone all of the time, freezing cold and torn and streets. But somehow, Yoshi still had one more trick up his sleeve. While confined in his hell, Yoshi's body was basically useless, but his mind was definitely useful. And what he did to escape Abashiri prison was absolutely insane. He realized the cell that he was being held in was made primarily of iron, and the food that he was given every single day was a very salty, useless food. And while he needed to eat as much of his food as possible to live, he always left a little bit of useless food behind, which he would splash directly on the bolts of the observation window on the door and on the hinges of his handcuffs and ankles. And slowly, over time, the salt and oxygen exposure on this metal would slowly cause it to rust and weaken. And after 6 months of slowly deteriorating the metal that confined him, he was able to make a move. Once again, at night, he started by fully removing his leg cuffs and then his arm cuffs. And then began the true challenge. He began unbolting the observation window on the front door of his cell, but there was still one problem. Even with the observation window bars removed, the hole was still too small for the human body. Well, at least for the average human body. Yoshi was, of course, a talented contortionist. Maybe because he was ultra flexible, or maybe just because he was ultra determined. He was able to dislocate his shoulders, shove his torso through this observation window, and flop himself on the ground outside of his cell, almost free. He later broke through an unprotected window in the ceiling in a different part of the jail, and was once again a free man. And also the first person ever to escape from Abashiri prison, one of the most brutal Japanese prisons ever. Similar to Alcatraz, the risks associated with escaping this prison aren't just within the walls. Even if you escape this prison, you are still in the extremely remote northern part of Japan with no civilization around you, extremely cold temperatures, and on top of all of this, mountains. But somehow, Yoshi still survived. He ended up finding an abandoned mine shaft in one of the nearby mountains, and was able to live in there alone, primarily eating nuts, berries, small animals in the area, and even crab fishing, which he reported to have learned from watching the bears, which is insane at first. But here's the thing, Yoshi didn't die in his mine shaft. He obviously got a bit restless, and decided that it was worth risking going back into civilization, and made the long trek to the nearest city, where he was surprised to see English and American soldiers, and what seemed to be a huge change in the culture. And that's when he grabbed a newspaper and got caught up to date. During his 2 years spent in this abandoned mine shaft, World War II had come to a close, Japan had surrendered, and America, for the most part, had taken over the entire penitentiary system, which to Yoshi was a huge relief, because he assumed at that point that there would be huge reforms, and at the very least, they'd be less on his case. And with this newfound information, he felt more confident to try to return to his family. But it was on this 50-day journey from where he was to his family that he found himself in trouble once again. Starving on his journey, he decided to pick some tomatoes from a tomato field that he was passing. And the farmer who owns this field just so happened to see Yoshi take these tomatoes. And this farmer mistook Yoshi for a local people. The two ended up fighting, and the farmer ended ended up dying as a result of the fight. Some claims state that Yoshi killed this man accidentally, and others claim that it was legitimate self-defense. Regardless, the farmer was killed, and Yoshi, once again, was shot. But initially, they didn't even know who they had. They only thought they had a murderer, but once he was fully booked, they realized that they had the infamous escapist, Yoshi Shimotani. And he was no longer sentenced to life in prison, he was sentenced to death. The year is now 1947, and Yoshi is being sent to Sapporo prison, where he will await his execution. And obviously, because Yoshi has now escaped 3 different prisons using 3 different methods, and now has theft and murder under his belt, the police are taking absolutely no chances with this final cell. Yoshi is being given 24/7 surveillance, reinforced doors and bars, and any opening that leads to this room is smaller than the human head. Because no matter how good of a contortionist you are, you can't make your skull smaller. So in this situation, there is absolutely no way that Yoshi escapes, right? This is obviously where the story ends. He was obviously later executed by the Japanese government, and that's history, right? Of course not. This is Yoshi we're talking about. And interestingly, this is one of the most simple escapes performed. Because since day one in his jail cell, Yoshi started playing Minecraft. Specifically by always looking up. Yoshi, up until this point, had always escaped through the roof, and his guards knew that. And every day when the guards would check on him, Yoshi would make sure that he was looking up. And as a result, the guards were always looking up, making sure that when they would check on Yoshi, they would always check on him. But this escape had nothing to do with it. Yoshi was going in Yoshi's cell was fortified on the walls, ceiling, openings. But one place that wasn't fortified was the floor. And over the course of a month, Yoshi would remove a floorboard and begin digging into the floor below his bed in secrecy until he had a usable tunnel. And once again, one morning, the guards were unable to get a response from Yoshi. And when they entered the cell, they realized that what was in his bed wasn't Yoshi, but once again, a pile of wood. Almost a calling card at this point. And for a year, Yoshi was on the run. And, as you may or may not know, he did go back to jail one more time. But this time was different. He ended up confessing to a random police officer who decided to offer him a cigarette in public. And at this point, Yoshi could not handle the guilt and confessed everything to this police officer who was simply offering a gesture of kindness. But when Yoshi was tried again, things were different. The system treated him with sympathy. Reform seemed to have taken place. The murder charge he had was dropped and considered self-defense. And as a result, so was his execution. His request to go to a Tokyo prison was accepted, and his new sentence was only 20 years. 20 years which he happily served, as his prison conditions were much better. And after 14 out of those 20 years, Yoshi was paroled for good behavior, and was for the first time in a long time, was fully free. This story is insane, and I do have to say, and while some claim parts are exaggerated, personally, I don't know. I think it's a great story. And for that reason, Yoshi is a bit of a legend in Japan, and there are even statues up of him, which is kind of interesting. But I suppose the story is something you can learn from. Yoshi passed away in 1979 at the age of 71, but he still lives on today in folklore, stories like this, films, books, and other stuff. The richest people from every state in the United States of America. Alabama. Jimmy Rain. Jimmy Rain is a 77-year-old billionaire with a net worth of $1.5 billion. What is he known for? Well, he's the founder and CEO of Great Southern Wood Preserving. I guess he's known for popularizing the luxury business by starring the cowboy Yellow Fella in his commercials. Let me know if you've seen this guy. I'm a Canadian, so I've never seen the Yellow Fella. And quick fun fact, Jimmy Rain is the only billionaire in Alabama, Alaska. Leonard Hyde. Leonard Hyde is the president of JL Properties, a commercial real estate development company in Anchorage, Alaska. Hyde has a net worth of $400 million and is actually tied for richest person in Alaska with his own business partner, Jonathan Rubini. Rubini is the CEO of JL Properties, and each of them own 50% of JL Properties. The company